Docker interview questions and answers. Beginner means advanced. Introduction. Docker is a containerization platform used to build, package, deploy, and run applications consistently across environments. Docker is widely used in DevOps, cloud computing, microservices, CI/CD pipelines, backend systems, Kubernetes environments. Docker helps developers package applications, isolate environments, improve deployment consistency, simplify scaling. 120. Docker Basics. What is Docker? Docker is a containerization platform for building and running applications. What is a container? Lightweight, isolated environment for running applications. What is containerization? Packaging application and dependencies together. Why use Docker? Portability, consistency, fast deployment, scalability. What is Docker Engine? Core runtime that runs Docker containers. What is Docker Image? Read-only template used to create containers. What is Docker Container? Running instance of Docker Image. Image versus container. Image is template. Container is running instance. What is Dockerfile? Script containing instructions to build Docker image. Basic Dockerfile example. From OpenJDK 17. Copy app_jar. Entry point, Java -jar, app_jar. What is Docker Hub? Public repository for Docker images. What is a Docker registry? Storage location for Docker images. What is Docker Desktop? GUI application for Docker development. What is Docker daemon? Background service managing containers. What is Docker CLI? Command line interface for Docker. What is virtualization? Running virtual machines with separate OS. Docker versus virtual machine. Containers share OS kernel. VMs run separate OS. Advantages of containers over VMs? Lightweight, faster startup, lower resource usage. What is layered architecture in Docker? Docker images are built in layers. What is immutable infrastructure? Infrastructure replaced instead of modified. 21 to 40. Docker commands and operations. How to pull Docker image. Docker pull nginx. Docker run nginx. How to run container in background. Docker run -d nginx. How to list running containers. Docker ps. How to list all containers. Docker ps-a. How to stop container. Docker stop container ID. How to remove container. Docker rm container ID. How to remove image. Docker rmi image ID. How to build image. Docker build-t myapp. Docker exec it container ID bash. What is port mapping? Connecting container port to host port. Example port mapping. Docker run -p 8080 nginx. What is volume in Docker? Persistent storage for containers. Why use Docker volumes? Data persistence, shared storage, backup support. Volume mount example. Docker run v myvolume/data nginx. What is bind mount? Mounting host directory into container. What is environment variable in Docker? Docker run -e env equals prod app. What is Docker logs? Docker logs container ID. What is Docker inspect? Docker inspect container ID. What is Docker stats? Displays container resource usage. 41 to 70. Docker networking, compose, and security. What is Docker networking? Communication between containers and systems. Types of Docker networks. Bridge, host, none, overlay. What is bridge network? Default isolated Docker network. What is host network? Container shares host network. What is overlay network? Multi-host Docker networking. What is Docker Compose? Tool for multi-container applications. Why use Docker Compose? Manage multiple containers. Easier configuration. Docker Compose file example. Version 3. Services. App, image, myapp. How to start Docker Compose? Docker Compose up. Docker Compose down. What is container orchestration? Managing multiple containers automatically. What is Kubernetes? Container orchestration platform. Docker runs containers. Kubernetes manages them at scale. What is Docker Swarm? Native Docker orchestration tool. What is scaling in Docker? Running multiple container instances. What is Docker restart policy? Automatically restarting failed containers. What is health check in Docker? Monitoring container health. What is multi-stage build? Optimized Docker image building. Multi-stage Dockerfile example. From Maven as build. From OpenJDK 17. What is Docker cache? Reusing image layers during builds. How to optimize Docker image size. C. Use Alpine images. Multi-stage builds. Remove unnecessary files. What is container isolation? Separating processes and resources. What is namespace in Docker? Linux feature for process isolation. What is cgroup? Linux feature for resource control. What is Docker security? Protecting containers and images. Docker security best practices. Check. Minimal base images. Check. Non-root users. Check. Scan vulnerabilities. What is Docker image scanning? Detecting security vulnerabilities. What is secret management? Secure handling of passwords and keys. What is read-only container? Container file system cannot be modified. What is least privilege principle? Grant minimum required permissions. 71 to 100. Advanced Docker and DevOps concepts. What is CI/CD with Docker? Automated build, test, and deployment pipelines. Docker role in DevOps. Standardized deployment environment. What is container registry in CI/CD? Stores built images for deployment. What is tagging in Docker? Docker tag app v1. What is semantic versioning? Versioning format like v1.0.0. What is blue-green deployment? Switching traffic between deployments. What is rolling deployment? Gradual replacement of containers. What is canary deployment? Releasing to small user subset first. What is stateless container? Container storing no persistent state. Why are stateless containers preferred? Check easier scaling. Check easier recovery. What is persistent storage? Data surviving container restart. What is Docker entry point? Main executable command for container. Entry point versus CMD. Entry point defines executable. CMD provides default arguments. What is image repository? Collection of Docker images. What is dangling image? Unused image layer. How to clean unused Docker resources? Docker system prune. What is Docker build context? Files accessible during image build. What is Docker ignore? Excludes files from build context. Common Docker interview topics. Dockerfile. Containers versus VMs. Networking. Docker compose. Volumes. Kubernetes basics. Common Docker problems. Large image size. Port conflicts. Memory issues. Container crashes. How to debug Docker containers. CAPS, Docker logs. CAPS, Docker exec. CAPS, inspect commands. What is container portability? Same container runs everywhere consistently. What is infrastructure as code? Managing infrastructure through code. What is immutable deployment? Replacing deployments instead of modifying. What is observability in containers? Monitoring logs, metrics, and traces. Making sure. Prometheus, Grafana, Elk Stack best practices for Docker. Small images, non-root users, health checks, proper tagging. How to become strong in Docker. Click. Build Docker files. Use Compose. Deploy microservices. Learn Kubernetes basics. Biggest Docker interview concept. Understanding container lifecycle and deployment consistency. Containerization, DevOps workflows, and scalable deployments. Final summary. Docker interviews focus on Docker images and containers, Dockerfile, Docker commands, networking and volumes, Docker Compose, container security, CI/CD integration, orchestration basics. Key idea. Strong developers understand how to build lightweight, secure, scalable, and portable containerized applications.